ID property to all of our logs in a single API request. Now let's go to the application layer where we already implemented a logging behavior. This is a mediator pipeline behavior, and let's go ahead and improve this implementation to also make better use of Serilog and structured logging. I'm going to start by updating the logger that I'm injecting. So instead of the tRequest argument, I'm going to add the fully qualified type to get better information in my source context for my logs. Right now, the logging behavior will only run for my commands. If I want to update it to run for all of my mediator requests, which are commands and queries, I can replace this generic constraint to target the I-base request, because my command and query abstractions implement this interface under the hood. I'm also going to add one more generic constraint, that the response type of my requests is always a result object. And I made sure of this when I was defining my command and query abstractions. The reason I'm doing this is to improve the logging in my handle method, and we can start by making a few adjustments. First of all, this is no longer a command. Let's call it a request, because we are working with both commands and queries. So I'm going to replace the command wording with request. I can also do the same for my structured log arguments, and these are the values inside of curly braces. And this is actually how you do structured logging in ASP.NET Core. So Serilog has native support for the iLogger interface, which is available in Microsoft Extensions logging. And you're probably already using it in your applications. However, you can also use it to write structured logs by respecting the structured log syntax. So to define a structured log property, you're going to create a variable inside of curly braces, and then you're going to provide the value for your structured log as another argument. If you had good tooling in your integrated development environment, you're going to get some syntax highlighting for your structured logs, like I have here, because I'm using ReSharper. And you'll notice that if I remove the name, I'll get a complaint that I defined an argument in my structured log, but I didn't provide a respective value. And the reason I updated my generic constraint to make sure that tResponse is a result is so that I can capture the result into a variable. And now I can check if this is a success result or a failure result. So if this is a success result, we can log that we processed this request successfully. So let's just use the existing log. Otherwise, if this is a failure result, let's write an error log saying that we processed this request with an error. But it would also be very useful if we were to pass in the error value. You could do this like we were passing in the request. For example, I can specify an error here and then use my result error object to pass this in, and this will be serialized as a string. Alternatively, you can serialize this object into JSON by adding the @ sign in front of your structured log parameter, and then this will be serialized into a JSON string, allowing you to filter based on the error properties in your structured logs. However, I prefer an alternative approach to specify this value, and this is using the log context. So I'm going to update this log here, push the error property into the log context. I'll need to install the Serilog NuGet package in my application project and then add the appropriate namespace, and I will be able to push the error value into my log context. Now notice that this time I'm specifying a third argument in the push property method, which is the destructure objects flag. This will tell Serilog to serialize my error into a JSON object when writing my structured log. So let's start the API and head over to Postman, where I'm going to send a few more API requests. First, I'm going to send a post request to the reserve booking endpoint for an apartment that doesn't exist. And we're going to get a 400 bed request with an apartment not found error code. If I open up the search apartments endpoint and try to look for some apartments, and let's use the first one that we get back in the response. So if I try to reserve a booking for this apartment that I know exists, we're going to get back a booking the first time that we try to run this request. And if I try to run this again, I expect to get a booking overlap error, which is what happens. So we generated some successful and failure API requests. And now let's head over into Seek and see what we get there. This is what we can see in our Seek dashboard. And for example, here is our error log that the reserve booking command processed with an error. If I open up the log information, you can see the error structured log property and the actual error instance serialized as a JSON string. The correlation ID property that we added inside of our middleware is also present, and I can filter by this correlation ID to see all of the logs for this API request. So you can see that we are executing our endpoint. Here are some database queries that we are running to be able to reserve our booking. And for example, this is the query that verifies if the booking is available. You can see that this fails, which is why we get a booking overlap error and we finish our API request. So this is how you can filter the logs for a specific request based on the correlation ID. Alternatively, I can filter based on the request, and let's look for any logs where the request name is the search apartments query. This allows me to find the log entries for this particular query, and then I can find the correlation ID to see all of the logs for this request. So now if I filter based on the correlation ID, I can see all of the logs generated for this API request. And this is why structured logging with Seralog is so powerful, because it gives you an excellent way to know what's going on inside of your application. Seek is an excellent addition on top of Seralog because it allows you to easily filter your application logs. You could be using some different service for this, like Application Insights, but the general idea remains the same. You want a service that will ingest your application logs and give you a way to analyze them so that you can extract the required information. And with this, we wrap up our implementation of structured logging, so let's move on to the next topic.